Hello and welcome to the 741 channel. Thank you for stopping by. Today we're going to be taking a look at SDRplay's newest product. This is the RSPduo. This is a 14-bit dual tuner SDR receiver. So what we'll do first is open up the package and take a look at the outside of the RSPduo, take a look at the connections and things like that. Then what we'll do is we'll take sort of a high-level overview of the press release and the technical spec sheet that was published with the radio and just kind of go through the basic architecture and how everything works. And then later on in the video we'll jump into using it with SDRuno. So here's a quick look at the product information card that comes with the RSPduo. You can see at the top those are all the major features of the RSPduo, and you can pause the video here and read through those if you'd like to. On the back of the product information card is the quick start guide. Now again, you can pause the video and read through this if you'd like to. And if you're new to SDRplay's products, I suggest that you kind of take a minute and go through this. Another thing that you may want to do is pause the video and take a look at some of the older videos that I made on SDRplay's other products. You'll find a link to those videos in the description below. So here's a look at the RSPduo. So the first thing that you may notice here is that the RSPduo comes in a metal case. Now that, of course, is good from a durability standpoint and also good for RF shielding and those kinds of things. So you can also see that all of the various input and output ports are clearly labeled in the silkscreen on the top cover. So over here on this side of the unit, you can see that we have two antenna ports for tuner number 1. We have an SMA 50 ohm port, or you can connect a high impedance antenna or signal source over here to the wire terminal connections. Over here we have another SMA port for tuner number 2. This one doesn't have a high impedance port, just the 50 ohm port. And then on this side of the unit you can see we have a typical USB-B connection for a USB cable, and then over here we have some coaxial connections for reference out and reference in. These two ports would be used if you were using this as a piece of test equipment in a lab instead of an over-the-air receiver like I'm going to show in this video. On the bottom of the unit you can see there are 4 rubber feet, and those obviously will just keep the unit kind of elevated off the desk a little bit. And then there's also the serial number label here. Now your serial number will be here underneath where I have the blue tape. Now you may need the serial number if you're going to register this and use it through the SDRplay website. So next up, let's take a look at the new product announcement for the RSPduo. If you don't already have a copy of this document, you can go over to the SDRplay website and download a copy for yourself. I'll have a link down in the description below. This is a handy reference to have, especially when you're starting out with the RSPduo, so I highly encourage you to get a copy. So you can see here on the first page we have a basic block diagram of the radio as it exists today. So starting from the left, you can see that we have the 3 antenna ports, the high impedance terminal block, and the 2 50 ohm coaxial ports for tuner 1 and tuner 2. Now you may be able to notice that the high impedance port and the 150 ohm port are both tied to tuner 1. Each has a separate front end that feeds into the tuner. Over here on tuner 2, you can see that there is only 150 ohm coaxial port, and that ties into one single front end for tuner 2. However, this port has bias T available for it in order to run an external amplified antenna. So you can see that both tuners feed into an IQ switch here. Now the RSPduo can be operated in 2 different functional manners. The first being one single receiver running an 8 megahertz bandwidth, or it can be configured as dual simultaneous receivers, each running 1.5 megahertz bandwidths. So regardless of which mode is selected, everything is then fed into the MSI 2500 and then routed through a USB 2.0 interface to the host computer. And then you can see here we have clock in and clock out ports available, and those are useful if you're running the RSPduo in a lab environment. So taking a quick look at page 2, you can see that a block diagram for the older RSP2 unit is shown, and you can see that there is only one front end and one tuner in the RSP2, and then a port switch to control between the two antenna ports that are on that unit. With the RSPduo, we are able to receive multiple signals across multiple bands at the same time using the two independent tuners. So in order to achieve the dual simultaneous receive, the RSPduo has to be run in low IF mode, and that provides the two receivers with an approximate 1.5 megahertz bandwidth to the SDRuno software. We'll talk a little bit more about that in detail as we get into the software and start using the radio. Next up, let's take a look at the more detailed block diagram for the RSPduo. So what you can see here is that the high impedance port, or the terminal block port on the RSPduo, is connected directly to the MSI 001. Now what that means is that for frequencies under 2 megahertz, the high impedance port should offer a little bit lower noise floor and subsequently a little bit better performance. Now this is useful for those of you who are doing medium wave broadcast band DXing and long wave DXing. This port may work better for you than the others. Okay, so you can also see that the two 50 ohm ports, one for tuner 1 and the one for tuner 2, offer more in the way of bandpass filtering. And they each also offer a selectable low noise amplifier. This should mean that these ports will perform better at frequencies above 2 megahertz. And you can also see that further down in the chain there is additional bandpass filters available to the two coaxial ports that are not available to the high impedance port. And again, over here you can see that bias T is only available on the 50 ohm port for tuner 2. So if you're running any kind of an amplified antenna, you'll need to connect it up to the coaxial port for tuner 2. So here on page 4, we'll just go through some of the highlights. The first thing that we'll talk about are the potential use cases for the RSPduo, and you can see here they list 3 possibilities, but there are many, many more. So the first one that they illustrate here is monitoring of 2 widely spaced bands, for example 40 meters and 2 meters. The second use case here that should be pretty popular with most users is the ability to monitor aircraft voice traffic as well as the ADS-B aircraft telemetry data at the same time. So the upshot of all of this is that when running in dual tuner mode, one tuner becomes the master and the other becomes the slave. And then they go on to give a couple examples of that here. Another thing that's new for the RSPduo is the SDRuno API. SDRuno now runs with a background window service to control communication between the RSPduo's dual tuners and the computer. The chart shown here gives a good overview of the RSPduo's available ports, sample rates, bandwidths, and frequency ranges available for each of the 4 basic operating modes available. The last 2 pages in this document illustrate how SDRuno works with the RSPduo. Instead of reading through the documents, let's jump into the software and just start using it. Now, if you haven't already done so, I encourage you to go over to the SDRplay website and download this document so you can have it as a reference. Before we get started with SDRuno and using some of the new features of the RSPduo, let me talk a little bit about how I have mine set up. Over here you can see that I've got 2 antennas connected. I've got one to the 50 ohm port on tuner 1 and one to the 50 ohm port on tuner 2. The antenna that I have connected on tuner 1 is connected through an SMA to SO239 adapter and then out through some coax to a 40 and 80 meter fan dipole that I have out in my side yard. So that's a good HF antenna. Over here on tuner 2, I have connected through the same adapter my 2 meter VHF vertical antenna. That antenna, of course, is good for VHF, but seems to work well for receiving on other bands as well. Over here, you can see that I have my computer connected to the RSPduo through a standard USB cable, although my USB cable has ferrites on either end that should help any noise that gets coupled onto the cable. Over here is a quick look at the computer that I'm using. You can see that it's an older HP desktop model, and it's running an AMD Phenom quad-core 64-bit processor. Now this computer is a little on the older side, but usually has no problem running the SDRuno software, even with the RSPduo connected and running in dual tuner mode. Now, having said that, this computer can bog down a little bit once I launch my screen capture program that I'll be using to record the bulk of the rest of this video. So if you notice any choppiness in the video as we go forward and start using SDRuno, more than likely it's the fault of my hardware and my screen capture program, and really not related to anything wrong with SDRuno or the RSPduo. One last thing to mention before we get started using the RSPduo is that I'm not going to go through the installation process of the software. It's pretty straightforward, and you can find tutorials on SDRplay's website, or you can watch some of my older videos on the subject, which I will link down in the description below. So as you can see now, I've got SDRuno up and running. Most of the differences that you're going to see between the RSPduo and the RSP1 and 2 are contained in the main window of SDRuno. The rest of the software more or less runs the same way that it does with the RSP1 and 2, so most of this video is going to be about the changes that are contained within the main window here. When SDRuno first starts with an RSPduo connected, it starts in single tuner mode, and you can see that by the word single in this button up here in the top of the main window. So for right now, I'm going to leave it in single mode and go through some of the other options that are lower down in the window here. So over here in the lower left corner of the main panel, you can see there are options for Tuner 1 and Tuner 2. By default, the 50 ohm port of Tuner 1 is active. If we wanted to activate Tuner 2, we would simply click on the other 50 ohm port to activate Tuner 2. Or if you wanted to use the high impedance terminal block port on Tuner 1, you could click that to activate it. The point being that you can activate any one of these at any given time in single tuner mode. Now if you're using an amplified antenna, you would need to connect that to the 50 ohm port for Tuner 2 and then turn on the bias T to power the amplifier. So with the 50 ohm port of Tuner 1 active, you can see that we have the option to turn on or off a medium wave / FM broadcast band filter. You can just toggle it on and off, or a digital audio broadcast filter on or off. If I change over to the high impedance port of Tuner 1, you can see that this notch filter changes so that only the medium wave broadcast band notch filter is activated. The digital audio broadcast is still there. But you may have also noticed that over here on the RF attenuator in the high impedance mode, the steps are a little coarser than what's available on the 50 ohm port. Down here on Tuner 2, if I activate that 50 ohm port, you can see that these notch filters are the same as the 50 ohm port on Tuner 1. So let's go back up to the top corner and focus on these numbers up here. What these numbers are telling us are what the current spectrum range, IF bandwidth, and IF bandwidth mode are set. By default, in single tuner mode, SDRuno is set to a final sample rate of 2 MHz with an IF bandwidth of 1.5 MHz in low IF mode. And then down here you can see that we are currently set to a decimation of 1. So what this all means is basically that this final sample rate is what is displayed over here in the main spectrum window once we activate the receiver. So now if I want to change the sample rate for any reason, maybe I want to see a smaller snapshot of the spectrum, I can reduce the sample rate by a couple of different ways. So as I said, we are currently set to 2 MHz. If I want to narrow that up for any reason, I can go to the decimation tab and I can choose one of these other options. The setting of 1 divides the sample rate by 1, so we get the full sample rate. If I set this to 2, what happens is the sample rate is divided by 2. We effectively halve the sample rate. If I choose that, you can see up here that the display goes from 1 MHz to 2 MHz. If I go down here to 32, you can see that I can narrow it up to 62.5 kHz. Narrowing up the sample rate can increase the performance, especially if you're using older hardware like I am. So choosing a high decimation number narrows the sample rate and reduces the CPU usage, as shown here in this fuel gauge. So as I said before, by default, the radio starts up in single tuner mode and low IF mode. In low IF mode, the IF bandwidth by default is 1.5 megahertz. If you want to increase your bandwidth and your final sample rate, you can do that by going up here to the settings button and then going here and changing from low IF mode over to 0 IF mode. Then I'll close this option pane and you can see an additional setting shows up here in the main window panel. And what this allows you to do is set the sample rate from between 2 megahertz and 10 megahertz. And this more or less mimics the behavior of the RSP1 and RSP2 units. But for right now, I'm going to go back to low IF mode and we're going to take a look at going into dual tuner mode. So to start dual tuner mode, I'm going to click on the button up here where it says single, and I'm going to choose dual normal. Now, if you were planning on using this with Dump1090 to be able to receive ADSB aircraft transponder data, you would use the dual ADSB, and I'll cover that later in this video. But for right now, I'm going to choose dual normal mode, and you can see that it switches over. So you can see here that the display has changed to dual with an M around it. What that means is that we're in dual tuner mode, and that this instance of SDRuno is now the master tuner. You can also see that down here the options for Tuner 2 have disappeared and we can only control Tuner 1 at this time. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to change over to a different workspace and window arrangement to make room for a second instance of SDRuno so that we can bring up that second receiver and see what it looks like. So in order to activate the second receiver, or Tuner 2 in this case, I'm just simply going to launch SDRuno again, and you should see that we'll get a second instance pop up here in a second. So you can see here that down in the bottom of the screen, my second instance of SDRuno has started. Now all of the controls that were available in the first instance are available down here in the second instance as well. But you can see that this one is for Tuner 2, and this one is for Tuner 1. But you can see in the second main window that it says dual with an S after it. And what that means is that this is the slave receiver. All of the controls that are available in the master session are also available in the slave session. You can see that really the only difference is that up here we have Tuner 1 controls, and down here we have Tuner 2 controls. Now you may also note that the windows for the slave instance of SDRuno are all labeled with a 1 preceding them, and all of the ones for the master are labeled with a 0 in front of them. So one other thing to note about dual receive mode is that both of the sessions are locked into a sample rate of 2 megahertz by default. Now you can narrow the sample rate by choosing any one of the decimation options, and they can be different between the two different sessions. However, the master sample rate cannot be made any wider. And you can see that by going into the settings, the IF mode is no longer an available option that we can change. So now that we've got all that out of the way, let's do a quick demonstration of how everything works here. Now you may be able to see up here that I've got my CPU usages pegged, and like I said before, that's mostly because of my screen capture program. Now when the screen capture program is not running, but both of these receivers are running, my CPU usage is only down about halfway. So in order to kind of mitigate that, I'm going to put both of these at 32 decimation to get the bandwidth as narrow as I possibly can. So now that I've got that narrowed up, you can see the CPU usage has dropped a bit. So here you can see that we've got on the top receiver WTIC 1080 out of Hartford, Connecticut, an AM broadcast station going. There's a Red Sox game being broadcast right now, and you can see that's receiving just fine. And then down here in the bottom receiver, you can also see that we've got a 2-meter ham repeater tuned in, and there's a couple of guys talking there. Now, it's kind of hard to hear both at the same time, but it is working, and you can hear the audio from both. So you can see I've got independent control of both tuners. I can mute the broadcast band and listen just to the 2 meter if I want to, or I can unmute this and mute the 2 meter if I want to do that. You can see that up here in the spectrum window, I can narrow up the bandwidth if I want to do that on the AM broadcast band, and it has no effect on the repeater that I'm listening to over there on 2 meters.
Cleveland hits a high fly ball to right shallow along the line. Second baseman out.
Conversely, I can go over to the secondary receiver and I can play with that bandwidth setting, and it has no effect on tuner 1. So you can also see that I've got both receivers going. If I want to stop one, I can do that. And that'll help kind of bring the CPU usage down a little bit as well. And you can see that I can start or stop either one. So one thing that I'll note is that on tuner number 2 in the secondary instance, I can't start that receiver unless the main receiver has been started first. So I can start that one, and then I can go over and start the second one. And then if I want to stop the first one, that's fine. It stops, and I can then still listen to the second one by itself. Okay, so that's kind of the basics of running 2 individual tuners on the screen at the same time and listening to 2 different audio streams at the same time. So what I think I'm going to try and do now is mimic one of the use cases in the press release, and let's see if we can receive some ADS-B aircraft transponder data while listening to the aircraft ATSC voice transmissions. So now let's take a look at getting the RSPduo running with Dump1090 on one tuner and the ATSC traffic frequencies on another. For the purposes of this video, I'm not going to document the installation of the Dump1090 software. If you want to learn more about that, you can go over to the SDRplay website. They have some tutorials over there on their website, or you can check the description below. I'll leave a link down there to a video that I made documenting installing and running Dump1090 on my RSP1A. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to launch SDRuno. Then I'm going to go up here to the RSPduo mode, and I'm going to change over to the dual ADS-B mode. So you can see up here, this instance of SDRuno is now in dual mode and is the master. So now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to close SDRuno and start Dump1090. Now the reason I have to close this is because I'm using a beta version of the software, and I don't think all the little bugs have been quite worked out. By the time you see this video, you shouldn't have to do this. You should be able to just start Dump1090 without closing SDRuno. But for the purposes of getting this working, I'm going to close it, and I'm going to go and start Dump1090 by searching for it in the Start menu. I'm going to choose the 2 MHz interactive mode, and you can kind of see it up here in the terminal window, and you can see there are things happening. That means it's actually receiving aircraft data. So for the moment, I'm going to bring this down over here, and now I'm going to relaunch SDRuno. And now you can see SDRuno has started, and if you note up here the RSPduo mode, it's still in dual mode, but it's now the slave. And that's because I started Dump1090 first. The SDRuno instance is now the slave. So now, before I turn on the audio for the ATSC traffic, I'm going to start Virtual Radar Server. And again, I'm going to go into my menu, find Virtual Radar Server. Now you can see Virtual Radar Server is started. I'm going to now click on this link here to open up Google Maps. So as you can see, we've got some aircraft up here on the map that the RSPduo is tracking. And of course, we've also got some ATSC traffic going on here. Now, I'm not entirely sure of all the frequencies here in southern New England, but this frequency seems to be active, so we're definitely getting audio out of it. Now, if you knew the correct frequencies for your area, you'd be able to tune into your local airport tower or traffic control station, and you may be able to hear these exact planes talking back to the tower, or the regional traffic control or whatnot. Another thing that I'll reiterate here is that the antennas that I'm using are not exactly the correct antennas for these frequencies. My ATSC tuner is connected to my 80 and 40 meter fan dipole, And the ADS-B tracking antenna is a 2-meter vertical antenna. I'm not getting quite the sensitivity that I could if I had the proper antennas connected, but I think you kind of get the idea here on how things are supposed to work.
Maintain point low 240 seat 23 Charlie.
134.0, East Coast Jet 21.
Good evening, British 2 Airways, landing level 190.
That's pretty much going to do it for the basic overview and first look at the RSPduo. If you want to learn more about the RSPduo, make sure you visit SDRplay's website, which is linked down in the description below, or just simply www.sdrplay.com. And stay tuned to my channel for more upcoming videos featuring the RSPduo. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you'd like to leave a comment or subscribe, feel free to do that as well. Thanks for watching.